Welcome back, anatomy students. Today we are going to talk about the ear. So the ear is in charge, of course, of hearing. That's the obvious one, right? It's also in charge of balance and equilibrium. And today I'm just going to talk about the hearing part, and we will save the balance and equilibrium for another day. So first of all, I want you to notice that the ear is divided up into sections, and there are three sections. So you have the external ear here. You have the middle ear here, and then you have the inner ear here. So the purple is the inner ear, the red is the middle ear, and the peachish flesh color, that is the outer ear. So the external ear is made up of the fleshy part, which is called the pinna. It's also called the auricle. So you might see either of those terms. So the pinna is only in charge of hearing, and it acts like a band shell. So if you're in choir or in band, you know, they put behind you this big shell on the stage. And the purpose of that is to capture the sound waves that y'all are creating and funnel them towards the audience. So your pinna does the same thing. It's capturing sound waves all around you and then funneling them inward to your external auditory canal. So the external auditory canal, you might remember from the bone chapter, was the external auditory meatus. So anytime you see auditory, you're going to think it has something to do with hearing. And you'll remember that this is in the temporal bone, right? So the external auditory meatus, we can call the external auditory canal. Same thing. So the external auditory canal is lined with a couple things. One, cilia, and two, modified sweat glands. These sweat glands are called ceruminous glands. And what do they make? They make cerumen, thus ceruminous glands. And what cerumen is your earwax. So you're familiar with earwax. You get out your Q-tips every day and you clean it out. You know, it's kind of a sticky substance. So anything that is sticky usually is serving a purpose to capture things so they don't get inside of you. So it is a protective function. So it's going to capture dust, debris, bacteria maybe, and keeps it from getting inside that very important middle and inner ear. The cilia as well. Cilia is usually used for brushing things. So hopefully it's brushing it out away from the middle ear. Okay, so the middle ear is also only involved with hearing. And the dividing line for the middle ear is your eardrum. So you know that commonly it is called the eardrum. Now we're going to change its name to the tympanic membrane. And that's not really that big of a change or an adjustment that you have to make in your schema of things. A tympany is a drum. So really the tympanic membrane is a drum membrane, which isn't that far from saying it's an eardrum. So the tympanic membrane is the divider between the external ear and the middle ear, this portion in red. And the middle ear contains a couple structures. One is the eustachian tube, and that's also called the auditory tube. So again, anything auditory has to do with hearing. You have an auditory canal externally. You have an auditory tube in the middle of the ear. And this auditory tube, this eustachian tube, it runs from your ear down into your throat, your pharynx. So you have an opening between your nose and your throat. It's called the nasopharynx. And the eustachian root tube runs diagonally in adults into that space. And so sometimes you get an earache, and then later you'll find that you have a sore throat, and that's because it's draining into your throat. The same thing can go the other way. Sometimes you start with a sore throat, and then you end up with an earache because if you had an infection, maybe that bacteria made its way up through the eustachian tube. So that's an unfortunate part of having those two parts connected. But what its job is to equalize pressure between the inside of your body and the outside of your body. So, you know, when you go up in altitude, you are going to an area that has much less pressure. And so we have to equalize between inside and outside. The same thing when you go down, so maybe you're diving underwater. And as you go down underwater, you're increasing pressure. And so this pressure causes a squeeze on the inside of your ear, and it's quite painful. So we have to get our eustachian tubes to open up in order to let air pressure balance between our insides and our outsides. And we can do that by yawning. That'll open up your ear. You can feel it when you do that. or swallowing, or chewing. So if you've been on an airplane and you know that you get earaches in the air, you probably are chewing gum when you take off. And you hear babies, they're crying like crazy because their eustachian tubes are not yet diagonal, they're horizontal. So they don't equalize as well. Plus, they're just little babies, so they don't know that if they swallow or if they chew or they yawn, that it's going to get better. So you got to feel bad for those little babies because their ears hurt. And then the other structures that are found in the middle ear are the ossicles. Together, the three bones of the middle ear are called ossicles. They each have their own names. And they're the smallest bones in your body. The hammer is the first bone, and it's also called the malleus. And then the incus is the second bone, also called the anvil, and the stapes is also called the stirrup. So they all have more than one name. The stirrup looks like the stirrup on a saddle, and that's how it gets its name. So their job is to change sound waves into mechanical vibrations. So when sound waves enter your pinna and into your external auditory canal, they hit the tympanic membrane, which starts to bounce, which hits the hammer, which starts to bounce, which hits the anvil, which starts to bounce, which hits the stirrup, which starts to bounce. So it's all about converting these sound waves into mechanical vibrations that will then go on into the inner ear. So here's your three ossicles. The hammer, which is called the malleus, and you know, a mallet is a type of hammer, right? So again, that's not far from your schema. Those two words are similar. The incus, which is also called the anvil, and then the stapes, which is also called the stirrup. So recognize either term because different resources will use different terms. Different teachers will use different terms, different websites, yada yada. Okay, so the base of the stapes rests on the oval window, it's called, of the inner ear. So the tympanic membrane goes into vibration, then all the ossicles go into vibration, and then it hits this inner ear. And now we're going to change those mechanical vibrations into fluid waves inside the inner ear. And I'll put a link to that animation in the show notes. So the inner ear is the only part of the ear that is going to both transmit impulses related to hearing and impulses related to balance and equilibrium. And again, I'm going to really focus just on the hearing piece today, and we'll talk about balance and equilibrium another day. So this purple portion in here, that's where we're at now, the inner ear, and I'm going to blow that up over here. So this whole structure is called a labyrinth. And graphics of a labyrinth are somewhat misleading. It looks like you could take that labyrinth out of somebody and manipulate it, but you can't. This is really just a hollowing out of your temporal bone. So it's a bunch of canals, little holes, little tubes that have been tunneled through your skull. So you can't actually physically take that structure out. It's not a separate entity. But that's how graphics make it look. So a labyrinth is kind of like a maze, right? So this looks a little bit like a maze. And there's the bony labyrinth, which is the part that is the temporal bone. And then there's the membranous labyrinth. So inside all of those tunnels, there's membranes, and then that's filled with fluid. You have two different fluids in here. The purple portion is the bony labyrinth, and it contains a fluid called perilymph. Peri, remember, means around. So it makes sense the perilymph goes around the outside of the labyrinth. And then the blue portion is the membranous labyrinth, and it's filled with a fluid called endolymph. So again, endo is within, and that should make sense that the inner fluid is the endolymph. Okay, so now let's take the labyrinth apart. So this coiled piece right here is called the cochlea. Kind of looks like a snail to me. The cochlea is where we find the organ of Corti, which is a structure that, or it's an area, maybe we want to say, that contains the sensory cells for hearing. And then this portion here is called the vestibule. A vestibule is an entryway, so this is kind of the entryway into the labyrinth. So a little bit ago, I was talking about the stapes or stirrup that is touching on the oval window. So here is that oval window, and when the stapes hits it, that membrane goes into vibrations, which moves the fluid, and then that's going to be a whole chain of events as well. So the vestibule is in charge of static equilibrium, just where you are in space. Are you standing up? Are you on your side? Are you on the other side? Are you upside down? These loop-de-loops looks like a roller coaster to me. So this is called the semicircular canals, and they're in charge of dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic is changing, so this is kind of like your equilibrium of motion. So we're going to go inside of the cochlea a little bit more and talk about hearing. So this big graphic, what we have, we're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So it's one big graphic. Here is our external, middle, and inner ear. We're going to enlarge this portion here. So here I can see in greater detail my tympanic membrane, my malleus, anvil, and stapes. I can see my whole bony labyrinth, and then I'm going to blow up just a portion of the cochlea, and this is that cochlea here. And then again, this is our organ of Corti, and we're going to blow that up over here. So sound waves are produced outside of your body, right? I'm talking to you, you're receiving my sound waves. And those sound waves are coming through as vibrations till they hit that tympanic membrane. And that tympanic membrane is now in vibrations. So that sound wave has already been converted, its energy, into mechanical energy. The mechanical vibrations then go through each of the malleus, the anvil, the stapes, and then it hits the oval window, which puts the fluid of the labyrinth into motion. So we're enlarging that here, and then we want to look at this portion in here. This is the organ of Corti. So this portion is where you find your hair cells. Hair cells are the sensory receptors for hearing, and you might remember receptors are the dendrites of sensory neurons, right? So the hairs are basically the dendrites of these sensory neurons. And now we're going to blow up that organ of Corti, and that comes out over here. So these hair cells, you can see they're bipolar. They have two ends to them, right? The dendrite, the axon. And these little hair cells, when the fluid, when the endolymph is moving, the fluid will brush these hairs and cause them to bend. And what is the response of that? A depolarization. So hopefully you're remembering from the nervous system, depolarizations cause action potentials. Action potentials are basically nerve impulses. So the fluid of the perilymph is in motion, and then it hits the membranous labyrinth, which puts the endolymph into motion, and the endolymph will brush past these hair cells, bending the hair cells and creating an action potential that will go to the temporal lobe of the brain. Pitches are interpreted based on where in the organ of Corti these hair cells are stimulated. So a high pitch, I have kind of a high pitch. High pitches are really short waves, right? And so they're going to land pretty shallow in the organ of Corti, and so those hair cells send signals to the brain, and your brain says that's a high pitch. And then really low pitches are long waves, and they're going to go really far into the organ of Corti. And so the deeper hair cells will be stimulated, and then they'll send signals up to the brain, and the brain will say, that's a really low pitch. So that's a little bit on how we interpret it, kind of simplifying it probably, but that's okay. So we're almost done. I just wanted to show you these hair cells a little bit more, and as the fluid moves past them, they depolarize and they send a signal to the temporal lobe. And so over here, this graphic is showing us the brain, and that red spot right there, that's your auditory cortex. So that is where your brain is going to interpret sound. So we're almost done. I just wanted to leave you with an interesting tidbit. Hearing is the last sense that we lose when we fall asleep. So when I was in school, I liked to play, like I would tape myself reading my textbook or reading my notes or going through study sheets, and I would play that as I fall asleep. Which could be helpful or not, I'm not sure, but I thought it was. And as I was falling asleep, even though maybe I wasn't paying attention, I still was hearing it, and hopefully that was being sent to my brain. It's also the first sense that we get back when we wake up. So that's probably why our alarm clocks are sound and not maybe flashing lights or something. So I just thought that was kind of neat information, and that's all I have to talk about with the parts of the ear as they relate to hearing. And tomorrow, I hope to talk about equilibrium and balance, and that'll be a shorty but a goodie. So thanks for listening. See you soon.